Shopify grows your business no matter how far or big you grow. Shopify is the global commerce platform that helps you sell at every stage of your business. Whether you're selling your fans' next favorite shirt or an exclusive piece of podcast merch, Shopify helps you sell everywhere. Shopify powers 10% of all e-commerce in the U.S. Allbirds, Rothy's, Brooklinen, and millions of other entrepreneurs of every size across 175 countries. Plus, Shopify's award-winning help is there to support your success every step of the way. Because businesses that grow, grow with Shopify. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/income, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/income now to grow your business, no matter what stage you're in.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can always reach me at the Welsh History Podcast at gmail.com, or you can always reach out to me on social media at Welsh History Pod on Twitter, also known as X, and on Facebook at facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast. And you can also help me by contributing to the show so that we can fundraise for the books that we need at patreon.com/Welsh History. And now on with the show. Welcome back to the Welsh History Podcast, episode 218, Anglicization Takes the Wheel. At the heart of education is the idea that the individual, child or adult, will take basic lessons as well as learn the concepts to evaluate and think in a critical fashion. This is the basic reason why we send our kids to school, is to learn, but also to be able to use their minds to come up with their own ideas. It allows us not only to be able to read and write and do arithmetic, it also allows us to determine for ourselves what we want out of our societies, no matter where we live, what type of education we have, or what language we speak. There is a reason that universities have been sites for protests and debates. It is part because students attend them and are hopefully challenged to consider different viewpoints and ideas. The idea of education as a builder of minds is not new. It has been with us for eons. And to quote one of those famous writers from the past, Plato, "The direction in which education starts a man will determine his future life." For Wales, education has had fits and starts. Higher education generally happened elsewhere, and it was only really starting to take hold as a primary way to grow up over the last 100 years. And not for everyone, of course. This would remain to be the case into the 1800s, and because of this, there is a growing understanding within the population of the need for literacy, and that it was a key to a better educated populace. First, educators, starting with the biblical slant of trying to teach religious education, knew that you could not understand and interpret the Bible if you couldn't read it, or at least someone in your family at least. So it was important to at least have some people trained and educated in reading and writing so that they could do that. And eventually, they add arithmetic to it because, of course, this is something that's key for business and understanding a lot of other things that come out of education. And it would then develop later into what we call the liberal arts, which includes a lot more subjects and ideas, but we're still a ways off from that at this point. However, arguments were beginning to take shape in the late 1830s and early 1840s over just what direction this education should take. No longer was it just a discussion about teaching people the Bible and teaching them how to read. It was now becoming a discussion of exactly how the education should work, who should be the ones distributing it, and in what language, more importantly. This was not just a discussion that was formed in Wales and discussed amongst the Welsh, but also in London and amongst many MPs and government officials, where the state of education was becoming one of the perceived reasons for why Wales was so unsettled during this period. Keep in mind that one of the things that came about because of all of the strikes, revolts, gate charges, all of the tolls that were being broken, the government was reacting to these in varying ways to try and put an end to them. And one of the arguments was that ignorance was at issue with some of this. The government would, in time, found the Royal Commission on the State of Education in Wales, which had long been referred to as the Blue Books of 1847, and these would be the foundation for one of the most infamous decisions made in Wales. This commission, initiated to assess the state of education in Wales, had a profound implication not only on Wales, but also the Welsh culture, language, and identity. In 1842, a commission was founded which was to look into the state of education in Wales, as I said, and noted that some Welsh boys employed in mines in Breconshire were learning to read English at Sunday school, but that they could only speak Welsh. The three commissioners, Ralph Wheeler Lingen, Jellinger Cookson Simons, and Henry Vaughan Johnson, undertook the inquiry, and it was their report which had such a lasting effect. The report, of course, as I mentioned earlier, about it was not positive, and it opened with a commentary based on a study done in Wales on the moral state of the people, and that was the founding message, was that it was a moral issue that drove them to do this. This investigation in 1842 to 1847 into the Welsh education system aroused fury amongst the Welsh population, not least reason because there was an accusation that would go within these documents that accused Welsh women of being immoral, of using their educational opportunities to try and create relationships with members of the opposite sex, that it was somehow terrible that they were even involved with them. And the report of the Commissioner Inquiry of South Wales, specifically in 1844, lamented the fact that the people's ignorance of the English language practically prevented the working of the laws and the institutions and impedes the administration of justice. It didn't seem to occur to the commissioners that the ignorance here was not the language, but their lack of understanding of it that was obstructing justice. The 1847 commission, which eventually wrote the Blue Books, was instigated by William Williams, a member of Parliament for Coventry. Ironic, of course, because the Williams last name is definitely pointing to someone who was of Welsh birth, or at least of ancestry, I should say. Williams believed that the disturbances caused by the Daughters of Rebecca against the toll charges and the riots at Newport would have been avoided had the perpetrators been able to speak and understand English, as if that was the whole reason why these people were so mad and were unable to understand what was being demanded of them by the English law. Of course, during this time period, there was a level of Welsh language press which was written by and for the members of the lower and middle and working classes. For by the 19th century, there was hardly any upper-class Welsh-speaking families, and this is where the problem begins. In the countryside amongst the gentry, and in England, of course, where some of these members of the upper society have moved, while still holding on to their Welsh lands and titles, they themselves had long since ditched Welsh to speak English. And to them, they saw that as the way to superior status. Wales, however, continued to produce entrepreneurs and middle-class farmers and other people, such as poets, who would continue to have opportunities to speak and learn and live their lives through the medium of Welsh. They didn't need English necessarily, except for in specific situations. And for a lot of people working in Welsh farms and eventually in the Welsh mining areas, most of the people you would see and speak with were Welsh speakers. That was a big part of the entire development of the Welsh industrial class in the early 1800s. And it was only now that they were starting to have an in-migration of English speakers, which were bumping up against these Welsh-speaking people. Williams's very backward idea that the way to fix the social problem was to get people to speak English ran up against what now we would consider to be quite insulting levels of racism, I think would be the word I would use, although that's not necessarily how I would look at it in this case, but certainly it has some parallels in the ideas and the desire to erase a language because you feel it doesn't benefit someone to the extent that you think it should. For example, the 1847 Report on Education in Wales considered that the languages of the Welsh workman keep him under the hatches, or keep him down. He is left to live in an underworld of his own, and march of society goes completely over his head. Schools conducted through the medium of English were considered to be the means whereby this undesirable state of affairs could be brought to an end. English education, it was believed, would also curb Welsh tendencies to riot, of which there was much evidence in this time period. Something that seems ironic and laughable in our own day and age, but certainly something that apparently the British English leaders thought was a reason for all the problems of this period. A band of efficient schoolmasters, wrote one commentator, is kept up at much less expense than the body of police and soldiery that was needed in order to enforce the law. In other words, this idea of a network of education that would mitigate the problems that they were seeing in society were the way to control the Welsh labor protest. It is why there becomes a complete network of elementary schools, but those aren't even created for another 40 years past this. So the reality of it is most of the education in this period is being done by private schools and private traveling teachers and different religious organizations. There wasn't necessarily some massive organization that was being run by the government or even necessarily funded by the government that was carrying out the education of children. And thus, if you come into an area where they predominantly speak Welsh and try and teach English, you're going to run into trouble pretty quickly. And even though eventually most of these schools would become formed under either under the Anglican Church or through what's called the National Society, the ideas still were built upon the concept of teaching Welsh children who predominantly could not speak any English, which must have made things extremely difficult.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold! Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
I'm Ken Harbaugh, host of Burn the Boats from Evergreen Podcasts. I interview political leaders and influencers, folks like award-winning journalist Soledad O'Brien and conservative columnist Bill Kristol, about the choices they confront when failure is not an option. I won't agree with everyone I talk to, but I respect anyone who believes in something enough to risk everything for it. Because history belongs to those willing to burn the boats. Episodes are out every other week wherever you get your podcasts.
English language schools were on the rise at this point, in part because of these interpretations of this report and the growing desire by the Anglican Church and others to spread levels of education to children in day classes. But in order to do that, they had to reach out to as many as they could, and the impact of English medium schools can easily be exaggerated. In the counties of Carmarthenshire, Pembrokeshire, and Glamorgan, in 1846, for example, only 30,000 pupils attended day schools compared to the 80,000 who attended the largely Welsh medium Sunday schools. The use of English in day schools probably represented the general wish of parents. After all, Welsh could be learned at home and in the chapel. In 1846, a small farmer in Carmarthenshire declared that he would sooner pay twice as much to an English master who knew no Welsh. Something that's fascinating to understand and perceive. English was perceived as being useful and profitable, a viewpoint encouraged by the utilitarianisms, which was winning increasing numbers of adherents amongst the Welsh in the middle class. The belief arose that the Welsh should be the language of the sacred matters and English of secular matters, a belief that did much to narrow the sphere in which the Welsh language was being operated. In 1846, the role of the Welsh language in education was extensively investigated, and a commission, as I said earlier, was set up to inquire into the state of this education in Wales, and especially into the means afforded to the labouring classes to obtain a knowledge of the English language." End quote. William Williams's speech, the MP we discussed earlier, that started this commission, was in the House of Commons on the 16th of March, 1846, and the commission were conceived from 3 young barristers or lawyers, all of whom were English and Anglican, and they collected a vast quantity of material, and the report, which was 1,252 pages long, was ready on April 1st, 1847. The language of the Commissioner's report has been described as colonial prejudice at its most blatant. The report drew a dark picture of Welsh society, emphasizing the vast gulf that separated almost totally English-speaking wealthier classes from the largely Mongolot or single-language Welsh poor classes. This was, of course, a fairly damning indictment, but is also a very detailed one, which recognizes that the class and religious divides which hampered progress in the education in Wales. Unfortunately, it also made some very severe generalizations along racial and moral lines that outraged nonconformists and led to further alienation from Anglicanism. As you can imagine, as the church was in part a leading speaker to this particular argument, it would be held to account by Welsh speakers for contributing to this idea and this understanding. Something that these 3 young and inexperienced lawyers obviously didn't understand or conceive when they wrote this report. Their lack of understanding and sympathy for the Welsh language or the culture seems to have undercut a lot of their ideas. Mixed in with this was the understanding, or lack thereof, of various belief systems and other churches and what they did or didn't do. And the idea that other faith groups somehow were lesser than the Anglican faith group definitely drove some of that prejudice. As an example, when they described schools in these other churches, they were given an idea that somehow these churches were being carried out and these services and classes in barns and stables. They had very little in the way of furniture and supplies, and thus it was giving an image of something that was much lesser and much less rigid and rigorous compared to their so-called English-style classrooms. This, of course, would create this idea of a sad state of education in Wales, with too few schools, with deplorable conditions, and unqualified teachers, with lack of supplies, and more particularly with lack of suitable English texts. This would, of course, build on their understanding and concept that somehow the Welsh were lesser because of this. If these writers of these documents thought that they were trying to either shame the Welsh population into learning the language that they felt important, or that they were going to declare themselves as saving them, they were not perceived in either way like that. A number of Welsh-speaking people began to see that this argument was definitely prejudiced and definitely shows a lack of understanding and a lack of sympathy towards their ideas. The idea that because an area is poor, that somehow the level of education would be poor by definition, especially if it's in another language, definitely led a lot of Welsh people to start to become very unsympathetic towards that argument, as you can imagine. And just as not every school was poor to this point just because they spoke Welsh, also not every school was well taken care of. Not every school had the amount of supplies they needed. Not every school had the most educated teachers. Those things were something that were definitely a drawback and something they needed, but rather than say it's a funding issue or it needs to be more standardized and more organized, they instead looked at it as being an issue of language rather than an issue of problems with the actual construction of education generally, something that would have been obvious had they taken the time to even bother to look into this properly. And instead, this whole thing led to what was then nicknamed the treachery of the Blue Books, and it gave rise to a great furor amongst the Welsh speakers, which, to be honest, was one of the most important developments for Welsh nationalism, because it broke the relationship between the Welsh population and the English government, and specifically the Anglican Church. Because it was so focused on the Anglican Church being the center of education, it forced Methodists and others into an alliance against this and back into their old dissenting ways. It inspired the Welsh themselves to prove that their purity, morality, respectability were actually unrivaled, and the attack on the morals of Welsh women, something that was a part of this, led to much discussion of the mother as the angel of the hearth, and the perception that these immoralities or gender issues were incorrect and needed to be corrected. The household language was usually determined by the mother, who was more likely than her husband to be Welsh speaker. Yet the notion that women were more devoted to Welsh than their men was belied by the experience of George Barrow at Pentraeth in Anglesey, where a young Welsh-speaking woman informed him in 1854 that English was a most genteel of all languages. Barrow then would write, "Gentility would be the ruin of Welsh, like it had been with many other things." As where the Welsh language is concerned, the Blue Book controversy had conflicting effects. For some Welsh leaders, it was evidence of the English contempt and was a reaction to goad them into a more nationalist voice, and one that focused around the Welsh culture and language as the center of Welsh independence. And other leaders, perhaps even the majority, became convinced that the removal of English contempt could only be ensured by making the Welsh as similar to the English as possible. Something that, of course, would be a continual discussion point and problem amongst the Welsh and English for many, many years, both in the past and to come, as we know all too well. Thank you, everyone, for listening. I just wanted to quickly say that I was ill last week, which delayed the release of this podcast specifically, and I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your day, And as I said at the beginning, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can always reach me at the Welsh History Podcast at gmail.com. Thank you once again. We'll talk to you later. Take care. Bye-bye. Welsh History Podcast is a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. To find more information on them, you can do so at evergreenpodcasts.com. Thanks for listening.
Coming up on 5 Minute News, I'm Anthony Davis. You might think it's partisan because maybe it's critical of one side or the other, but it's not. It's just the truth. And I think that's also something that's kind of unusual for Americans listening to the radio or to podcasts, because the news landscape in the States has been so partisan for so many decades. So 5 Minute News is verified, truthful, independent, unbiased, and essential world news daily.
Hello, my name is Peter Zablocki, and I'm a historian, author, and college professor. I'm thrilled to invite you to check out Evergreen Network's History Shorts podcast. Every Tuesday and Thursday, join me on a journey through time, exploring the little-known and hidden gems of history. In each bite-sized episode, I'll dive into my original research to bring you intriguing historical curiosities you've probably never heard of, uncovering the fascinating stories that have shaped our world, from forgotten figures to overlooked events. And the best part? I've condensed all this historical goodness into manageable chunks, perfect for your on-the-go lifestyle. Whether you're commuting to work or squeezing in a quick break, History Shorts fits into the little time you probably think you don't have. Subscribe now and never miss an episode of the History Shorts podcast, available wherever you get your podcasts.